Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. It was only a week ago that Vice President J.D. Vance stood on the stage in Munich and he told Europe that its greatest enemy was itself. No mention of Russia. Stunned Europeans, I was there, looking at them all, they scrambled to an emergency meeting in Paris on Monday, at least those President Macron chose to invite. They were desperately trying to respond while the US started talks with Russia in Riyadh. At Chatham House, we've set out what the UK and others should do next. 2 papers are on our website. But it keeps moving. President Trump's declaration that Ukraine's President Zelenskyy is a dictator has made that choice for Europeans even starker. They're forced to consider whether the US has switched sides and is now, in effect, Russia's ally. We're going to talk about that, about the cards that the US, Russia, Europe and Ukraine hold in negotiations if there is to be a deal. And we'll talk about the really tough predicament that Keir Starmer finds himself in as he heads to Washington next week. We've got great guests to talk about this. Let me start with Orysia Lutsevych. She heads up the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, and she is in close touch with people in Kyiv. Georgina Wright, visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. She's worked at the European Commission and NATO and will give us the inside track on the European perspectives. And I say perspectives because Europe is not united on this. And Timothy Garton Ash is Professor of European Studies at Oxford University. He'll expand on this sense of what this all means for Europe, as well as giving us a historical perspective on how wars end. Hint, it's not always in negotiations. Let's start by looking at the huge shifts in the relationships in the last week. Orysia, you said driving through London and you saw on a billboard Trump has called President Zelenskyy a dictator. What did you think?
I thought I lost my way around the galaxy, to be honest, because it's the world upside down. You almost have a feeling that Trump's administration hacked our planet, where the white is a black and the black is a white. The reversal of narratives where Trump was actually saying, we want to have secure peace, we want to end this war, the people are suffering, turned into actually humiliating the party to the negotiations, kind of labeling Zelenskyy a dictator in the eyes of American audiences, in the eyes of his constituents as, freedom-loving people. It's a black mark, and it's hard to see how we can move from there to any constructive bilateral relations.
We're clear that economic factors play a big part in Trump's rhetoric, getting money back from Ukraine, not paying for Europe's defense, all this kind of stuff. But there does seem to be some kind of admiration or wanting to be liked by Putin. As far as we can tell, the relationship is something odd and special.
Officials from the first Trump administration, they all say that Trump trusts Putin, that he actually distrusts his own intelligence evidence agencies, and he trusts Putin. He trusted Putin's line on Russian interference in U.S. elections. He couldn't believe Russia poisoned Skripal, despite all the facts on the table. And this is where I think there's a danger for Europe, not just for Ukraine, because of that trusting relation.
We'll come on to that. Tim, I would love your thoughts on this. Why has Trump done this?
These last few days I've been thinking of an aphorism of Stanislav Let's. I thought we'd reached bottom, and then I heard knocking from underneath. Because every day we wake up thinking it can't get worse, and then it does. Whether it's important to say Trump's own assault on the constitutional order of liberal democracy inside the United States, which is an important part of the story, or Gaza, or now Ukraine. And what we've seen is Trump bullying his friends, Canada, Mexico, Denmark, Europe, and appeasing his enemies. I think, I don't think there's much sense in going deep into what one might call Trumpology. It may be that there is simply no consistency in what is clearly a totally disinhibited narcissistic personality who tells us he was saved by God from an assassin's bullet in order to make America great again and save the world. There's a wonderful term, sane washing, trying to make sense of Trump's nonsense. But for me, the important conclusion, Bronwen, is simply this. We should assume the worst case scenario, that we cannot now we in Europe, cannot now rely on Trump for supporting Ukraine or ultimately long-term for our own security. So that rather than speculating about the mind of Donald Trump, I think the real conversation we need to have is what do we do next in Europe?
Georgina, I would love to take you to that meeting on Monday. It wasn't the whole of the European Union, was it? It was those who President Macron had invited to Paris. What did you think that meeting showed?
I was a bit worried, to be honest, because Macron tends to do this, sort of organise meetings on a whim in the hope that it's going to spur some action, when in reality it often spurs thinking and not much action. But I think in this point, it was probably a good thing, if anything, to show Ukraine that Europe is not simply going to side with President Trump and abandon Ukraine. So I think it was, in terms of symbolism to Ukraine and to President Zelenskyy, an important message. But, the sort of conclusion of the meeting was that we agree that we need to do something, but we disagree on what we need to do. And I just don't think that is a helpful message at all. And to come back to what Timothy was saying, everything that J.D. Vance said during the Munich Security Council, and also everything that we've heard really from President Trump, all of this we could have, it's not really a surprise. And it feels that in Europe we tend to, instead of hoping for the best and planning for the worst, we're simply hoping for the best and not planning for the worst at all. And I think this is deeply problematic. And President Macron sort of brought together the main players in European defence. Now, he did ruffle some feathers. I heard the Czech Republic, for example, were a bit offended not to be invited, particularly as they were one of the major supporters in Central Europe to Ukraine. But they sort of understood that this was one meeting. It was certainly not the meeting, that there would be plenty of others, and that they would be represented, of course, through NATO and the EU. But I think the time has come, really, where we have to deliver something concrete, and we can't just sit around saying we need to do more and not actually deliver more. And I think that's going to be the key quest now, between now and whatever happens in these negotiations.
Was there any agreement on Monday?
There was agreement that we needed to do more, and that was it. And we needed to increase defence spending, but we've been saying that for years.
I just want to push a bit more, though, Georgina, on this question of whether Europe or parts of Europe can act together. Macron had made the point of not inviting Slovakia, not inviting Hungary, who are sympathetic to Russia. So he picked his chosen band, and even they couldn't agree on, for example, what kind of forces to put together or how to have a conversation about putting forces together. One German who's close to the CDU said, I think we're seeing the end of Europe, which feels a bit extreme, but this is a point, this is a crisis when Europe needs to make a decision together.
Yeah, I think Europe has shown that in times of crisis it can come together. Now, whether that's, things about how you respond to a global pandemic or how you sort of change and no longer rely on Russian gas, the EU and Europe at large have been able to step up and respond to crisis. But this feels, it's rocking Europe in ways that perhaps the other crises have not, in that we've always been able to rely on the United States for security guarantees. And I think Paris sometimes feels a bit alone in this, because for years, President Macron, but also his predecessors, have said, of course we need to work with the United States on defence, on shared interests. They're an ally, but we need to be able to act alone when we can't work with the United States. And there has been real pushback inside Europe saying, well, no, we are dependent on the United States. We don't want to give the impression that we'll do anything without the US, for fear that they will, remove the security guarantees completely. And it feels like we're exactly in the same context right now. And I think that Paris sometimes feels that there is a sense of urgency. We can do things without the United States, and nothing prevents us from presenting an option and then saying, would you like to join, or do you want to provide a backstop? But we need to have something to put on the table. Of course, the criticism from other European countries is, well, you talk, but you don't actually provide that much support to Ukraine. So maybe you should show that you can put things on the table as well. So we're in this sort of, dance where we all agree on the fundamentals, but we disagree on how we're actually going to meet the challenge.
Tim, is Europe going to be able to get its act together on this, or is the crisis just not big enough yet?
If the combination of Trump and Putin doesn't make us get our act together, what on earth will. Listen, I don't know about you, Bronwen, but I had a brief moment of fleeting optimism over the weekend with the European response. The trouble is, what did we then do as Europe? We managed to pluck disunity out of that fleeting unity by disagreeing about a doubly implausible hypothetical. Okay, so the whole discussion was about a peacekeeping force. And Keir Starmer spelled out the two conditions for British boots on the ground in Ukraine. Number one, there should be a peace signed by Russia and Ukraine. And number two, there should be US security guarantees. These are both extremely unlikely to happen. I cannot see any formal peace agreement which both Putin and Zelenskyy can sign. Zelenskyy cannot sign an agreement that formally concedes territory, but Putin has declared 4 oblasts and Crimea already to be part of the Russian Federation, and Trump's not going to give the security guarantee. So the real issue for us, I think, us Europeans, including Britain, is first, can we enable Ukraine to defend itself right now for the next 6 months, stabilize the front line? And Mette Frederiksen, the wonderful Danish prime minister, I think was one of the best speakers on this, said, hey, we promised to deliver 6 or 7 air defense systems to Ukraine. We promised that last summer. How many have we actually delivered? You know, there are 2 Patriot batteries just sitting in Valencia in Spain. So stepping up the military and economic support right now, and then I think crafting a strategy to get to a position of deterrence for a possible ceasefire, rather than some notional peacekeeping force for a formal peace that's most unlikely to happen.
Tim, thanks for that. So let me use that as the plank to take us into our second question, which is whether there is a deal to be done and all these different elements. And you've started talking about some of them already, including forces and territory. Orysia, maybe I can start with you on this. And just if you could spell out for us what you think Russia's aims in this are.
So Putin's aims are the same as when he started the war. He wants to erase Ukraine from the political map of Europe. He wants to annex parts of Ukrainian territory, and for the other parts that he cannot militarily take, because we see that throughout the whole of last year, he only took 400 square kilometers and Ukraine has 600,000. That's just not viable for him. He wants to install again the regime in Kyiv that will be friendly to Russia, that will act the way Belarus acts, if you want. This is the model. Or the way Georgia now has been subjugated also to the Russian model. He wants also to have United States out of Europe. This is what he wants when he sent his ultimatum to Washington before invasion. He wants the NATO capabilities moved to the border of 1997. And fundamentally, he wants to carve out the world between US, Russia, and China into these spheres of influence where they agree on non-interference and a free hand to go. So how that would mean in Ukraine, what that would mean in Ukraine case, it means Ukraine should have no army, Ukraine should have no military production, Ukraine should not build any reserve, it should be armless prey to Putin's desire. This is what he wants to achieve. And what is so disturbing is that President Trump now repeats exactly from that playbook, saying that Ukraine, should have these elections in order to oust Zelenskyy. Basically, that's what he says. We don't like this dictator, and this is the same goal as Putin has.
And one of Putin's team, I forget exactly which one, whether it was Lavrov, his foreign minister, or one of the others, said, we wouldn't mind if Ukraine was part of the EU. Do you think that is part of the plan of getting a kind of Trojan horse into the EU, another one?
No, I think it's a cynical statement, because they know if Ukraine is in disarray with no security umbrella, its politics in mass, Ukraine cannot deliver EU reforms. It will be the case of Turkey, that was supposed to be a member of EU but never did.
Georgina, do you think there's a deal to be done?
Between Ukraine and Russia?
That is a very good question, actually. Who is this deal between? Okay, between the US and Russia, but in a way that Europe and Ukraine can accept and would allow Ukraine and Europe to thrive?
Well, certainly what Marco Rubio and President Trump have said so far is not very encouraging, because it doesn't seem to meet at all Ukraine's expectations, let alone European expectations. So I'm not very optimistic. I was mildly encouraged when Marco Rubio said Ukraine and Europe may not be around the table, but we're certainly taking on board what they have to say. And actually, I was thinking back to a speech that Marco Rubio gave at Chatham House when I was working there years ago, when he was talking about the Russian threat and Europe. So I think he is someone who actually does understand. And Mike Waltz, of course, Trump's national security advisor, is someone who also understands, I think, that the threat that Russia poses not only to Ukraine, but to broader Europe, to the Western order, and also how if there's a bad deal there, it might embolden China. So I do think that they see the broader picture, and they may be more willing to listen. But certainly, I think what President Trump has outlined is not very encouraging, and I don't think this is something that Ukraine would accept. And Europe's line on this is, we will only accept a deal that Ukraine itself accepts.
Just one thing about sequencing that was voiced about ceasefire, elections, and then peace deal. So they've agreed between Russians and Americans to have these three phases and separate ceasefire and the peace agreement. So they do not want Zelenskyy to bring any peace agreement to Ukrainian people.
That is a really interesting point. Tim, do you think there's a deal to be done?
Well, there may be a quote-unquote deal negotiated between Trump and Putin. Is it one that Zelenskyy will accept, that Ukraine will accept, that Europe will accept? I think not. I would take a fairly large bet that we won't see any peace deal in that sense in the foreseeable future. There are all these cliches people trot out endlessly. One is, it's up to the Ukrainians to decide. Well, that's a moral principle, but actually they can't go on fighting without Western military support, and the West provides half of their civilian budget, of the total budget. So it's not, in fact, up to the Ukrainians to decide. People say it's about sovereignty, not territory. It's about both, obviously. When you go to Ukraine and talk to people, obviously territory matters. If you happen to live there, it matters rather a lot to you. But the third cliche is, all wars end in negotiation. Really? Remind me of the negotiation which ended the Korean War? I think not. Remind me of the peace treaty that ended the Second World War. The Second World War did not end in a negotiated peace. The peace treaties that finished the Second World War were only signed in 1990. So I think the realistic question is, how do we build up and sustain Ukrainian defense such that it can stabilize the front line and reach what Jonathan Powell, now again in British government, has called a hurting stalemate. And at the point when you get to this hurting stalemate, I think then you can get a ceasefire, and then it's going to be more like the challenge we had with West Germany in the 1950s and 60s, or South Korea in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. How do we build up a sovereign, independent Ukraine that is capable of becoming a member of the EU and eventually of NATO as a Western country de facto, with, of course, as a reality for some time to come, tragically, Russia controlling something like 1/5 of its territory.
It looked, before President Trump waded in since his inauguration, it looked as if we might be there, in the sense that the losses that Russia was suffering were considerable. There was much speculation that it might have only 6 months more fight in it, though much the same being said about Ukraine as well. Orysia, what if Ukraine says no? All these talks and everything, what capacity does Ukraine, President Zelenskyy, to say no to these things and keep on fighting?
What I hear from military experts, they say if all American assistance stops, it will be very difficult to sustain the fight. Partially it's because of other satellite support, intelligence assistance, not just the hardware. But Ukraine can hold up 6 months, 7 months. thanks to its own production of drones, which is Ukraine produced 1.5 million drones last year, and its production capability, something that Zelenskyy said, it twice more than the funding that is available for Ukraine to produce. So it can produce.
I'm going to ask you one of the most sensitive questions, though. Does that mean that President Zelenskyy would have to drop conscription of young men down to age 18, 19, 20?
It's already happening, not through the conscription. It's being presented as a special recruitment program for 18 to 24.
So voluntary at this point?
Voluntary, with a quite high payment of, in Ukraine, it's a bold number of million hryvnias. You get free education, you get zero mortgages, support for your family. He's just announced it 2 weeks ago, also in response to calls from the Trump administration to recruit 18-year-olds. But also the big question is Europe. And here's the idea that I think we're not discussing enough because so much focus is on the boots on the ground. It's actually an air defense, that European air defense that is not, say, close skies, but where Europeans use their aircraft to actually destroy Russian missiles over the whole territory of Ukraine where there's nuclear power stations. Because that is in the international law possible to defend nuclear power stations, and then it would also protect those troops on the grounds if they ever come, that there will be part of Ukraine protected, and then Ukraine is able to move its air defense and its troops closer to the front line and keep resisting Russian advances. That would actually stabilize much stronger than just boots on the ground.
Okay, we're going to have a lot of conversation, I suspect, in the next week or two about boots on the ground, aircraft in the air, and so on. Let's turn to our third question, though, and what the UK should do. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, as we've heard, is travelling to Washington, D.C. next week for his first face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump since Trump's inauguration. Georgina, do you think the UK can be the bridge between the US and the rest of Europe that Keir Starmer has talked about?
I mean, I think the UK should certainly try. I'm not sure the UK can be the bridge, and that's because I think President Trump has shown that he's rather erratic. He will speak to whoever he wants to speak to on the day. And there are other leaders in Europe who have, I think, a warmer relationship with President Trump. I'm thinking notably of Italy's Giorgia Meloni, but also Hungary's Viktor Orban. I think on the question of the war in Ukraine and broader European security, I think Italy has a real opportunity here because President Trump, but also Elon Musk, really like Giorgia Meloni. I think they called her the lioness. I think Keir Starmer should certainly try, but I think he's going to have to say something more than boots on the ground, I think, and showing that there is some form of kind of alliance, intra-EU, Europe alliance on how to support Ukraine without the United States, or without the United States leading, would be very important. And that's where I really sort of look at France and the UK. I mean, you've got the two European nuclear powers with the largest armies in Europe. That is where I think there should really be movement. If France and the UK can't agree on something and then rally other countries around, I think that's deeply problematic. I'm encouraged to know that the governments and the armies, frankly, are working together. There have been many discussions over the past years, and they have accelerated in the last week, so I am encouraged with that. But I think Keir Starmer has to offer something. And also because, President Trump doesn't pay that close attention to European politics or intra-EU relations, but the UK is no longer a member of the EU. So to play that bridge, and for other European countries, I'm thinking France and others, to really trust the UK to play that role, the UK is going to have to show that it can balance the relationship with the United States and its relationship and reset with the EU. And this is beyond the discussion now, but I think it matters in terms of getting other EU countries to trust London.
It's a really interesting point, and military chiefs say to us, British ones, actually culturally, the forces that they find most congenial to work with are the French. For all the history there, and the ones they find most alien to their own practices and culture are the Americans, though obviously there has been great formal alliances and military cooperation there. Tim, what should Keir Starmer say?
So the idea that Britain is the bridge between Europe and America is the hoariest old cliche about British foreign policy. And, you and I have heard it, I don't know how many thousand times over the last 50 years. And the problem, as Georgina rightly said, is the definite article, the bridge. of course, we can be a bridge, but there's the Italian bridge, there's the Polish bridge. Actually, it's less plausible now than it was, say, at the time of Tony Blair, when Britain was still a major member state of the EU. But obviously, he should try. But I want to connect this to what Orysia said, which I think is really important, because I would take the conversation, as it were, down a notch to much more concrete proposals about how we actually, let me put it slightly dramatically, save Ukraine. So the air defense ideas, right? The so-called Danish model. I was in Kyiv in September. Everybody there was saying, do what the Danes are doing. We have an amazing dynamic defense industry. It needs funding. Give your contracts directly to the Ukrainian defense industry and the actual steps we need, and then say, what are the strategic enablers that we will still need from the United States for Europe, really, since we're talking about lions and lionesses, to do the lion's share of supporting Ukraine.
Now, I can see that might work as a tactic, and it is very good advice to try and keep this granular, to keep it on what Britain can offer. But you've also got the question of whether Keir Starmer signs on for these things that Donald Trump is saying. And he's made the point of calling President Zelenskyy in the past day or so. One of his ministers, Lisa Nandy, was on the BBC saying, of course, President Zelenskyy is not a dictator. And so, and there is pressure, there's been pressure on the Foreign Secretary David Lammy to come out and denounce these statements of Trump. So it's not an easy path to follow, is it?
It is, but it's very striking that we like to think of ourselves, we the Brits, as, robustly outspoken. And that was part of the rhetoric of Brexit, after all. But in the last few weeks, German politicians, not to mention French politicians and Danish politicians and most other Europeans, have been much more robustly outspoken in defense of our democracy, in contradicting the absurd and simply false statements that Trump has made. And by comparison, I have to say our government has sounded at times like craven sycophants. And I don't think that Trump respects that. As we've all been saying, he respects strength. Since we're not a member of the EU, at some point there may become a real choice between closer security relationship with Europe in the course of the reset and our economic relationship. If we are getting a special deal, for example, being spared the heaviest tariffs by the United States, but at the same time saying we're having this great reset with Europe, I think our European partners are not going to be very happy about that. So there are some hard choices down the road.
There are. We might be a bridge with not a secure footing on either end. That seems to me the greatest danger for the UK, of not developing the relationship with either because of trying to keep the other one on side. Orysia, I wanted to ask you, imagine Keir Starmer goes to Washington, well, he will next week, and he comes out with all these offers about what Britain can do of troops and aircraft and so on. Supposing Donald Trump says no, President Putin says no NATO troops in Ukraine, that's a condition of it all. Is all this European talk and UK talk about what it can do on the ground, is that just a fantasy if Putin says no?
You've pinpointed the problem, and it is what Rubio said, that America and Russia are seeking geopolitical cooperation. That geopolitical cooperation could put restrictions on European access to American weapons, American systems. This is a danger not just for Ukraine, but for Europe overall. That is why President Zelenskyy is calling for this European plan without United States. Imagine you get this answer, what do you do? And some suggestions, what you do, you then possibly seize Russian sovereign assets, you create the defense bank, you pool resources to procure equipment. You can still propose Trump, okay, can we buy this from you? If you don't want to behave like an ally, can you be a contractor to European security? Possibly, yes, because Trump likes when people buy things in America. Buy from America LNG, maybe that will also sweeten the bitter pill. It's very, very commercial, I think.
Well, we've got a couple of suggestions there for Keir Starmer. Try and have agreed your lines with President Macron first about what forces can go and keep the commercial offer there as well, and very much look at what Europe can do on its own.
Just to echo on sort of what Orysia said, I think buy more, American arms is obviously something that will sell. The French are going to hate it, but I think, other European countries are very much in that mood. But I also think the other thing that Keir Starmer really needs to do is create links between what's happening in Europe and globally. And I think if the United States, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you know that you can't really tackle the China challenge alone. And so there is something to be said about burden sharing in Europe and burden sharing elsewhere. And so how can we work with you to tackle that challenge? And what would we need from you on Europe to be able to support you? And I think that's going to be really key, creating a link between different theatres.
Just very quickly, we haven't mentioned the elephant in the European room, which is, of course, Germany, Europe's central power. Germany has an election this Sunday. The likely next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has been very clear in his support for Ukraine. And Germany, unlike Britain and France, has the fiscal headroom with debts, only 60% of GDP, very significantly to increase spending. So if there's going to be a stronger European answer on all of this, it absolutely needs Germany as well as Britain and France.
I completely agree, and I was writing in the FT this morning about how European countries should pay for more defence, but it's not in Germany's case, but in many cases by borrowing more, I think, because of the speed that is needed. On that, I think we're going to have to pull it together and wait to see what happens in Washington next week, or indeed what happens even before then, because it is moving so fast. From all my guests, thank you very, very much. Orysia Lutsevych from Chatham House, Georgina Wright from the German Marshall Fund, and Professor Timothy Garton Ash from Oxford University. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please do leave us a review. Please also look on our website for the torrents of thoughts and videos and events that my Chatham House colleagues are bringing together on this. Thanks for listening. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Speak to you next week.